The sirens cut through the quiet of our street, not in a frantic wail, but in a slow, deliberate pulse, the kind that makes people step out onto their porches. A military ambulance, white and gleaming, rolled to a stop in front of my parents' house. The gold seal of the United States Army Medical Corps glinted on the door. 2 uniformed medics stepped out, then me. Dress blues? Pressed sharp enough to cut cap squared on my head gloves, white against the black leather of my service bag. Every neighbor who could see us froze the scene, framed by the late afternoon sun. My parents stood on the porch, the screen door half open, their faces locked somewhere between shock and outrage. "Jennifer!" My mother started, her voice pitching high. "What is this?" I didn't answer her. I looked past them into the shadowed hallway of the house I grew up in and said clearly, "I told you I'd come for him." 2 days earlier, I hadn't been thinking about ambulances, uniforms, or public scenes. I'd been sitting in my kitchen sipping black coffee when my phone rang. It was my cousin Mark's voice, tight and hurried. "Jenny, did you know Grandpa's been sick?" "Like really sick?" My hand tightened around the mug. "No. No one told me." "What's going on?" Mark hesitated. "He's barely eating. Cough's bad. Looks like he's lost 20 pounds. I stopped by yesterday, but your folks wouldn't let me in. Said he was resting." The word resting hit my gut wrong. I called my parents immediately. Dad picked up on the 3rd ring. "Jenny, everything okay?" "No, Dad. I just heard Grandpa's sick. How bad is it?" A pause. Then his voice flattened. "He's old, Jenny. What do you expect? Doctors can't stop the clock." "That's not an answer," I said. Mom's voice chimed in from the background, sharp and impatient. "We've got it handled. Grandpa stays home. No hospitals, no doctors." I could almost hear her crossing her arms. "What do you mean, no doctors?" I asked. "He's a tough man, but dragging him around for tests will only make him worse." Dad replied. "We've decided." "You've decided. Not him. Not me, the only other person in the family who had power of attorney paperwork signed by Grandpa himself 3 years ago after Grandma passed." "Let me talk to him," I said. "He's resting," Mom snapped. "You can call back in a week." A week. They were going to let him sit there untreated for another week. After the call ended, I pulled out my file box, the one where I keep my own military documents, and found the folder Grandpa had given me. Right on top was the notarized medical proxy form. Beneath it, a letter in Grandpa's neat, blocky handwriting. "Jenny, if I can't speak for myself, I want you to do it. You've got the spine and the sense for it. And I know you won't let anyone push you aside." I set the letter down and stared at the proxy form. The Army had trained me for logistics, for coordination, under pressure for moving people and resources fast. And now, those skills weren't going to save a soldier in the field. They were going to save my grandfather. That night, I made the call that would change everything. "Hey, Morales," I said when my friend from base picked up. "You still running with the medical transport team?" "Yeah." "Why?" "I need a favor. I've got a patient who isn't getting the care he needs. I have legal authority to move him, and I need it done right." There was a pause on the line. "Then send me the paperwork. We'll make it happen." I sent the scans within the hour. By morning, the operation had a date, a time, and a team, a military ambulance, 2 medics, and me in full dress uniform. Because if my parents wanted to make this a battle, I was going to win it on my turf. I didn't sleep much that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Grandpa sitting alone in that dim living room, the curtains drawn, the TV flickering on his face. I kept hearing my mother's voice, clipped and final. "Grandpa stays home. No hospitals." She'd said it like a sentence, not a decision, like she was locking a door and throwing away the key. The next morning, I called my parents again, half hoping they'd come to their senses. Overnight. Dad answered this time, his tone casual, as if yesterday's conversation hadn't happened. "Morning, Jenny." "Morning. I'm coming over today to take Grandpa to the doctor," I said, skipping pleasantries. A pause. "You're not," he replied. I took a slow breath. "He's sick, Dad. You can't just..." Mom's voice cut in sharp enough to slice the air. "We said no. He's fine. He's old, Jenny. Old people get sick. The hospital isn't going to change that." It wasn't the words that hit me hardest. It was the ease with which she said them. No fear, no worry, just dismissal. You don't get to make that decision alone, I said, my voice lower now. Yes, we do, Dad said. We live here. We see him every day. You're off doing your army stuff. That phrase, your army stuff, it landed like a shove. Like my years of service, the deployments, the endless drills, the months away from home meant nothing. You think because I'm not here 24/7, I don't care, I asked. Mom gave a humorless laugh. It's not about caring. It's about reality. The reality is, he's too weak to be dragged around. We're making him comfortable. Comfortable. I'd heard that word before in military briefings whispered between medics when a wounded soldier's chances were gone. It was the language of giving up. When I hung up, my hands were shaking, not from fear, but from anger. If they thought comfortable was enough for a man who'd never once quit on his family, they didn't know me at all. I sat at my kitchen table staring at the stack of documents I'd pulled from the file box. The proxy form, the signed VA consent, the letter. The letter was what stopped me cold. You've got the spine and the sense for it. Grandpa had known this day might come. He'd known I'd have to stand up not just to strangers, but to family, the hardest enemy you'll ever face. I pulled out my notebook and started writing a plan, just like I would for any mission. Contact Morales for transport. Confirm medics' availability. Prepare all legal paperwork for immediate presentation. Scope out the house before arrival. Control the environment, witnesses, visibility, timing. This wasn't going to be a quiet slip-in, slip-out rescue. If I had to, I'd let the whole street see exactly what was happening. Not to humiliate Grandpa, but to make sure my parents never tried something like this again. That afternoon, Morales called me back. We're set. Thursday, 1600 hours. That work. Perfect, I said. He hesitated. Jenny, this is family. You ready for the fallout? I looked at the letter again. I'm ready. I spent the next day gathering what I needed. 2 crisp copies of the proxy form. Grandpa's VA card. My own military ID and orders verifying I was on authorized leave. A folder with notes from his last checkup proving the sudden decline was new and urgent. I also called Dr. Patel, a VA physician. I'd met at a veterans fundraiser last year. When I explained the situation, she didn't hesitate. Bring him in. We'll be ready. The morning of the operation, I took my dress blues to the cleaner for a final press. Standing at the counter, I caught my reflection in the glass. It struck me how calm I looked, even as my mind ran through every possible scenario, from a screaming match on the porch to them trying to physically block the medics. Calm was good. Calm meant control, and control meant they wouldn't win. That night, I laid the uniform out on my bed, each ribbon aligned, each button polished. It wasn't just clothing. It was armor, and tomorrow I'd need every inch of it. The night before we moved, Grandpa, I spread everything out on my kitchen table, like a field desk printer. Warm copies of the medical proxy. Grandpa's VA card, my leave authorization, a yellow legal pad, with bullet points so tight they look like stitching. Beside the paperwork sat a ceramic mug I'd given Grandpa years back that said, "World's Quietest Hero." He'd laughed when I gave it to him and said, "Quiet's how you get the work done." That was the plan now, quiet, precise, unavoidable. I dialed Morales again. He answered on the first ring. "Still a go for 1600?" he asked. "Affirmative," I said. "I'm emailing you the proxy form with notary seal the VA card and my orders. I'll carry originals in a red folder." "Copy! I'll run the paperwork by our OIC and the VA intake desk so nobody gets sticky at the curb. You bringing dress blues?" "Yes." "Good," he said, and I could hear the faint smile in his voice. Nobody argues with dress blues. When we hung up, I sent the packet, then texted him copies of my ID front and back with the last 4 digits obscured. In the Army, you learn to respect both procedure and privacy. If you want a mission to go smoothly, you take care of the boring parts. Boring wins wars. I called the VA hospital next. The operator transferred me to Dr. Patel, the internal medicine physician who'd promised to be ready. "Sergeant Hall," she said using the rank, even though we'd only met once at a fundraiser. Transport team briefed me. What do we know clinically? Rapid weight loss, productive cough, increased lethargy, I said. Last documented exam 10 months ago. He was ambulatory and sharp then. Could be pneumonia, could be CHF exacerbation, she said. Could be something else. Either way, none of that is watch and wait. We'll prep intake chest x-ray CBC, CMP, BMP, EKG. If he's hypoxic, we'll start oxygen right away. It was like someone had opened a window, the sound of a plan. Actual medicine. Thank you, doctor. She paused. If family obstructs, brief the medics to call this in as a welfare check. We'll back the transfer under medical necessity. Understood. I hung up and stared at the red folder. The edges were sharp enough to leave a line on my palm. I slid in a final sheet. A concise one-pager I'd written for the medic's grandpa's full name, and DOB my authority, VA eligibility. Dr. Patel's extension, and a line I underlined twice. All communications go through me. At 2200 hours, with the house quiet, except for the ticking kitchen clock, I opened the shoebox where I keep old letters and pulled out Grandpa's from my first deployment. I'd read it 100 times, but I read it again. Jenny War teaches you two kinds of courage, the kind you show when people are watching and the kind you show when nobody is. The second kind is harder. You'll do fine with both. I ran my finger under the words, not to trace them, but to anchor myself to the man who wrote them. I remembered his hands nicked from a lifetime of work, steady even in old age, tapping a nail into a fence post, as if the wood needed not force, but persuasion. He believed things should be built to last fences, promises people. I tucked the letter into the red folder, not because I needed it for authority, but because I needed him with me. Sleep came in short, jagged pieces. I kept seeing my parents on the porch, the screen door half open. I kept hearing Mom, Grandpa stays home. Not tomorrow, I thought each time I woke. Not tomorrow. I rose before dawn and ran 2 miles along the river to burn the nerves down to something workable. Back home, I ironed the uniform one more time, even though it didn't need. It buffed my shoes until I could see the overhead light as a perfect circle and set my cap in the passenger seat like a second pair of eyes. At 1200, Morales texted, "Team confirmed ETA 15V5, staging 1 block south to avoid crowding the driveway." "Copy," I replied. "I'll be on site at 15:30. Recon first. My parents have a history of digging in." He sent back a thumbs up and the emoji for a locked padlock. Soldiers talk in codes, both official and human. The lock meant, "We've got you." I drove to the neighborhood and parked behind the elm trees on Willow Street, 1 block over from the house where I grew up. The act of parking away, of approaching on foot, wasn't drama. It was discipline. You learn to arrive with your eyes open. From the corner, I had a clean line on the living room window. The curtains were drawn to a dim glow. At 1510, a neighbor, Mrs. Rourke, a widow who used to pass out full-size candy bars on Halloween, walked up the porch with a casserole in a dish, cozy. I watched my mother crack the door and talk. The door didn't widen. The casserole went back down the steps with Mrs. Rourke. Control the environment, keep people from seeing what they might talk about. It was an old trick. At 1517, I saw movement at the window, the outline of a thin shoulder, a head tilted to one side. My throat tightened. I recognized the slope of Grandpa's neck. I checked my watch, 15:31. Time to stage. I stepped back, sent Morales my location, and by 15:46, I heard it, a distant, measured siren. Not the frantic scream of disaster, but the disciplined metronome of authority on the way. The ambulance turned onto our street exactly at 15:55, just as Morales promised. It idled a house away while the team did their own quick look. Then the driver eased forward and parked at the curb like a flag planted in disputed soil. The back doors swung wide. 2 medics stepped out. Specialist Chan and Sergeant Vega, crisp uniforms, practiced calm. Morales followed in duty, Green's clipboard under his arm. "Sergeant Hall," he said, nodding once. "We are on the record and by the book." "Roger," I said, handing him the red folder. Authority forms on top. VA copy second. Dr. Patel's expecting us. If either parent obstructs, we call it as medical necessity and proceed. Understood. I put on my gloves, squared my cap, and for a second, the sounds fell away. The hum of the engine, a dog somewhere down the block, the faint rattle of wind through dry leaves. I thought of the letter, the kind you show when nobody's watching. Then I looked at the porches filling with neighbors and thought, or when everybody is. We walked together, me in dress blues, medics rolling the gurney, folded flat Morales with the clipboard. The screen door opened before we reached the steps. My mother stood framed there, hand on her hip, eyes sweeping the uniforms like they were a mess to be cleaned up. "What do you think you're doing?" she said. Behind her, my father hovered like a shadow. I kept my voice even. "We're here to take Grandpa for medical care. I am his medical proxy. You've been notified." "No." Mom said the word snapping like a twig. "Grandpa stays home." She reached for the door. Morales slid the clipboard between the frame and the wood, not touching her, just occupying the space. "Ma'am, please review the authority forms. This is a lawful transfer for medical evaluation." Dad stepped forward, face flushing. "You can't just..." I held up the proxy and the VA card side by side like a pair of badges. "We can, and we will. And if you attempt to prevent medically necessary care, I'll request a welfare check and file a report for elder neglect before I leave this porch." A quiet, collective intake of breath moved across the neighbor line like a breeze. For the first time, Mom's eyes flicked past me, to the ambulance, to Chan and Vega, to the gold seal on the door. She wasn't prepared for the sight of procedure. People rarely are. "Where is he?" I asked. She squared her shoulders, resting. "Where?" Dad swallowed. "Living room." "Thank you," I said. "Medics with me?" We stepped past them into the house that had raised me, and for the first time felt smaller than the truth coming through its front door. The air inside the house was heavier than I remembered, a mix of closed curtains, stale coffee, and that faint metallic scent you start to notice in places where illness lingers too long. I led the way down the hall toward the living room, the medics following close behind with the folded gurney. Morales stayed at the door, keeping my parents occupied with the clipboard and calm, deliberate words. Grandpa was sitting in his recliner, a thin plaid blanket over his lap. The light from the TV flickered across his face, deepening the hollows under his eyes. He looked smaller, his shoulders sloped, but when he turned toward me, there was no mistaking the spark that had always been there. "Jenny," he said, his voice rasping but steady. I knelt beside him, careful not to jostle his legs. "Hi, Grandpa. I'm here to take you to the VA hospital. We've got a team ready for you." His gaze flicked to the medics and back to me. "Your parents?" "They don't get to decide this," I said quietly. "You do. And I already have the paperwork to make it happen." He gave the faintest smile. Always did follow orders when they made sense. Specialist Chan crouched to his level. "Sir, we'll keep you warm and secure on the ride. It's about 20 minutes to the facility. Dr. Patel's expecting you." Grandpa nodded slowly. "All right." We worked together to stand him up, sliding the blanket around his shoulders. Vega positioned the gurney and lowered it to chair height so Grandpa could sit without strain. Every movement was efficient. Practiced the kind of quiet professionalism that says, "We've done this before, and we'll do it right again." From the hallway, I could hear my mother's voice rising in the kind of tone she used to use when arguing with insurance companies. "This is unnecessary," she was saying. "He's fine here. He doesn't need..." Morales cut in his tone, patient but immovable. "Ma'am, our orders are clear, the authority is valid, and delaying care could have legal consequences. We are proceeding." The gurney wheels squeaked softly as we rolled Grandpa toward the front door. He adjusted the blanket with a kind of quiet dignity, ignoring my parents' expressions as we passed. I noticed neighbors gathered on the sidewalk now, some holding their phones, some just watching. On the porch, the light hit Grandpa's face full on, and for a moment I saw the man from my childhood, the one who taught me to bait a fishing hook and to never measure myself by someone else's yardstick. "Feels good to breathe fresh air," he said, his voice almost a sigh. We secured him in the ambulance, Vega checking vitals, while Chan attached a portable oxygen cannula. His O2 sat was lower than it should have been. "Good call bringing him in," Chan murmured. Before I climbed in, I turned back toward my parents. "This isn't optional," I said evenly. "You can follow us to the hospital if you want to be part of his care. But keeping him here without treatment stops today." Dad's mouth opened like he might argue, but my mother's hand on his arm stilled him. She was looking at the ambulance, at the gold seal, at the uniforms, at the neighbors staring. For the first time, she looked unsure. As we pulled away, Morales riding in the cab, I sat in the back beside Grandpa. The hum of the engine and the rhythm of the road were oddly calming. He shifted his gaze toward me. "Didn't think you'd have to fight this battle." I squeezed his hand. "Didn't think I'd have to either. But you taught me not to wait for someone else to do the right thing." His eyes closed, but the corners of his mouth curved up. "Good lesson." Halfway to the hospital, Chan checked his vitals again and glanced at me. "BP's low O2 is improving, but he needs evaluation as soon as possible. Could be pneumonia, could be something cardiac." "We'll be there in 10, I said. I looked down at Grandpa's hand in mine. The same hand that had steadied me on a bike when I was 7, held my shoulder the day I shipped out, and now, frail as it felt, still had a grip like it meant something. When the hospital came into view, its brick facade bright in the afternoon light, I felt the tension in my chest loosen just a fraction. This was the first checkpoint. He was out of the house in care, away from people who thought comfortable was a substitute for treatment. But as much as this was a win, I knew it wasn't over. There were answers I still needed, truths my parents had buried deep enough that I'd have to dig them out in the open. And when I did, I'd make sure the whole town saw what they'd tried to hide. The moment the ambulance doors swung open at the VA hospital, we were met by a small team in scrubs and masks. Dr. Patel herself was at the front, clipboard in hand, eyes scanning Grandpa before he was even rolled onto the sidewalk. "Let's get him inside," she said briskly. "Room 3A is prepped." Vega and Chan guided the gurney down the ramp with practiced ease while I walked alongside, keeping pace. Grandpa's grip on my hand didn't loosen until we crossed the threshold, and the cool, clean air of the hospital replaced the stuffy heaviness of my parents' living room. Inside, they moved fast. Blood pressure cuff inflated on his arm, pulse oximeter clipped to his finger, blood drawn into vials labeled and whisked away. A portable chest x-ray machine rolled in the tech, moving with the quiet efficiency of someone who knows time is a factor. I stood in the corner, letting the professionals work, but watching every step. Dr. Patel glanced over. "You were right to bring him in. His O2 saturation was in the low 80s when you picked him up, and there's fluid in his lungs. We're starting antibiotics and a diuretic. This could have been fatal if left much longer." The words landed like a weight I'd been carrying, suddenly getting heavier, not lighter. I called Morales, who was waiting outside with the ambulance. "He's stable, but it was close. Thanks for getting us here." "You did the hard part," he said. "You stood your ground." I slipped my phone back into my pocket and turned toward the hallway. This was the part where most people would breathe easy, maybe go grab a coffee. But I wasn't done. My parents were in the waiting area, sitting in 2 plastic chairs, angled slightly away from each other. Mom's sunglasses were perched on her head, arms crossed. Dad was staring at the floor. "You can go in and see him in a few minutes," I said evenly. "But first, we need to talk." Dad's jaw tightened. "About what?" "About why you refused care for him when you knew he was sick. About why you didn't tell anyone else in the family. And about what exactly you were waiting for." Mom's lips pressed together, the faintest twitch at the corner. "We were trying to spare him the stress of—" "Stop," I said, my voice low. "This wasn't about sparing him stress. This was about control. And you lost it the second I showed up." The sliding doors hissed open, and a woman in a blazer walked in, the veterans advocate Dr. Patel had called when we arrived. She introduced herself as Ms. Holloway and asked if she could join our discussion. Given the concerns raised, she said it's important we're all on the same page about his rights and the legal implications of denying care. Mom's eyes narrowed. Legal implications. Ms. Holloway nodded. In this state, preventing an elder from accessing medical treatment can be considered neglect. If there's evidence of intent or financial motive, it can escalate to exploitation. Dad's head jerked up. We didn't. I pulled the red folder from my bag and slid out a copy of the proxy form. You knew I had this authority. You knew and you ignored it. There was a beat of silence where the only sound was the soft ding of the elevator. Then Ms. Holloway continued, "Here's what's going to happen. You will not interfere with his care going forward. You will not make unilateral decisions without consulting his medical proxy. And you will cooperate fully with the care team. Am I clear?" Mom's eyes flicked from the advocate to me, and for once, she didn't have a ready retort. "Yes," she said finally, the word clipped. A nurse appeared at the doorway. "He's asking for you," she said to me. I left them there and walked back to room 3A. Grandpa was propped up slightly, the oxygen cannula in place, color returning to his cheeks. "How's the ride treating you now?" I asked. He smiled faintly. "Better. You look like you've been working." I pulled up a chair. "It's not over yet, but you're safe now. That's what matters." He squeezed my hand. "Safe is good, but truth is better. Don't stop till you get it." And I wouldn't, because saving him physically was only the first part of this operation. The next part would be making sure everyone, my parents, the neighbors, the entire town if necessary, knew exactly what they'd tried to do and exactly how I stopped it. By evening, the monitors in room 3A blinked with steadier numbers. Oxygen in the mid-90s, heart rate calm. The antibiotic hung in a slow medicinal drip bead by bead, pulling him farther from the cliff my parents had parked him on. Dr. Patel came in with the portable X-ray films clipped to a backlit panel. She didn't waste time. He has a right lower lobe pneumonia and signs of fluid overload. Nothing exotic, nothing inevitable, treatable if you treat it. The word treatable hit me like a bell struck hard. Behind it, I heard my mother's voice from yesterday. Grandpa stays home. No doctors. Could this have been avoided? I asked. Maybe not the infection, Patel said. But the severity? Yes. Delay turns a manageable problem into a dangerous one. You did the right thing, Sergeant. I nodded, but my jaw tightened. Doing the right thing was not the same as being allowed to do it. That was the part I intended to fix. "Doctor," I said, "can we document your findings for a family conference?" She understood immediately. "I'll have the note ready." The veterans advocate, Ms. Holloway, met me in the corridor outside the room legal pad balanced on her forearm. "We'll use Conference B at 1900, she said. "I've asked a charge nurse to join us and Dr. Patel will open with the clinical summary. You as proxy will chair." Chair. The word sounded formal, almost ceremonial, but families like mine listen when the furniture is heavy enough. I texted my parents the time and location. No emojis, no please, just family conference. 7 p.m., conference room, B, mandatory. They read it, the bubbles appeared, then disappeared. Fine. At 18:58, I stepped into conference B. Fluorescence hummed overhead. The table was laminate wood, the chairs too light for the gravity in the air. Dr. Patel sat at one end, chart open. A charge nurse named Lewis set a pitcher of water and a small tray of paper cups in the center like peace offerings for a meeting that wasn't going to be peaceful. Ms. Holloway took a seat beside me, pen ready. My parents came in at 1902, their lateness, a habit they wore like a privilege. Mom's mouth was a straight line. Dad's was fixed in neutral, the gear he preferred when truth approached. They sat across from me as if a border ran down the middle of the table. "We'll begin," I said. "Doctor." Dr. Patel folded her hands, voice crisp. Mr. Hall presented with hypoxia fever and radiographic evidence of pneumonia complicated by fluid retention likely related to cardiac strain. "We initiated oxygen antibiotics and a diuretic," he responded. "In my medical opinion, delay in seeking care increased his risk significantly." She let the words hang long enough for their weight to register. "This is treatable," she continued, "but it required treatment." Dad cleared his throat. We were trying to keep him comfortable. Nurse Lewis spoke gently but firmly. "Comfort is pain management and rest after evaluation. Comfort is not isolation and guesswork." Mom's eyes flashed. "You don't know what we deal with at home." Ms. Holloway leaned forward, tapping her pen once. That's why there are caregivers, home health nurses, facilities, and family. What you don't do is unilaterally bar access to medical care. He has a designated proxy. You ignored that. I slid the proxy form across the table. He signed this 3 years ago. You saw it. You knew. Dad looked down. Mom didn't. He's old, she said. Hospitals are hard on old people. Pneumonia is harder, Dr. Patel said, not unkindly. Denial is hardest of all. Silence pressed in. The clock on the wall clicked forward. Somewhere in the building, a code was paged overhead, the burst of urgency reminding everyone present what real emergencies sound like. Ms. Holloway broke the quiet. Here's the administrative side. As of now, all decisions regarding Mr. Hall's care will go through his proxy, your daughter. You will not obstruct transport appointments, prescriptions, or visits. If you do, we will file with Adult Protective Services. Additionally, if there's evidence that medical delay was used to influence financial outcomes, that becomes a separate matter. Mom's chin jerked. Financial outcomes. I held her stare. Cut the theater. I saw the certified mail on the hall table last month. The insurance policy renewal, the property tax notice, the household transfer pamphlet you left next to Grandpa's chair like it was a magazine. Dad shifted. You've been going through our mail now. I've been seeing what you've been ignoring, I said. And so will everyone else. Mom finally looked away. I didn't miss it. People think guilt is a shout. It's a flinch. Dr. Patel closed the chart with a soft thud. He'll remain inpatient for at least 48 hours. If he meets criteria, we'll transition to step down, then discharge with home health and follow-up cardiology. He'll also be evaluated for pulmonary rehab. Discharge to my care, I said. If he doesn't return home with me, he goes to a place where I control access. Nurse Lewis nodded. We'll document that. We can arrange training for you on the meds and home oxygen if needed. I turned to my parents. You will bring his personal items from the house tomorrow, ID, wallet, glasses, phone. If you want to be included, you show up with those and with respect. If not, stay out of the way. Dad opened his hands, a gesture I recognized from decades of negotiations over smaller things, soccer practices, holiday schedules, lawn repairs. Jenny, this is getting theatrical. No, I said, this is getting accountable. Ms. Holloway slid a simple agreement across the table, a typed page with 3 lines and 2 signature blocks. We agree not to interfere with the medical proxy. We will cooperate with the care plan. We acknowledge that failure to do so may be reported. They signed, not because they were sorry, but because their options were shrinking. Sometimes you settle for the right outcome before you chase the right feeling. After the meeting, I walked them to the glass doors. Evening had drawn a deep blue over the parking lot. Sodium lamps buzzed like a faraway storm. You can see him now, I said. Keep it calm. Keep it brief. Mom paused with her hand on the handle. You're making a spectacle of this. I met her eyes. No, I'm making a record. She pushed through the door without answering. Dad hesitated. We love him, he said, as if love were a receipt you could show after a purchase went wrong. Then show up at 10 a.m. with his things, I said, and with a better definition of the word. I went back to room 3A. Grandpa's eyes were closed, the lines around them softer now that the oxygen was doing its quiet work. I pulled a chair close and sat. The fatigue settled across my shoulders, but underneath it was something steadier, then exhaustion, purpose, cooling into resolve. He opened one eye like we were sharing a secret. How bad was the meeting? Not the worst I've ever been in, I said, but it moved the ball. He smiled, then coughed a smaller cough than earlier. Moving the ball's how you score. I squeezed his hand. Tomorrow, I'm going to do something else. What's that? Make sure the people who looked away can't, I said. Not anymore. He nodded, like a general approving a plan he'd known I'd make. Do it with grace, he said softly. But do it. I will. I stepped into the hallway and texted 3 neighbors, a pastor who ran the food pantry, the commander of the local VFW post, and Morales. The message was short, Saturday, 1100, Hospital Garden. Honoring a veteran. Spread the word. If my parents wanted Grandpa hidden in a dark living room, I would bring him into the light in front of everyone. Not to humiliate them for the sake of humiliation, but to restore what they had quietly taken witness, gratitude, truth. And when they stood there facing what they tried to bury, I would give them one last chance to choose the right side of their own story. Saturday came with a sky so clear it felt staged, the kind of blue that makes flags look brighter. The hospital's courtyard garden had been swept, the flower beds edged the benches wiped down. A volunteer crew from the VFW hung a fresh stars and stripes between two maples. It moved in the breeze like it had something to say. I wheeled Grandpa out at 10:58. He wore his best jacket, navy blue brass buttons, polished to a soft gleam. On his lap, folded with ceremonial precision, was his old army blanket, the one he'd kept since Korea. His oxygen cannula trailed to a small portable tank, Morales steering the cart with the same steady hands he used in the field. People had come. Not just the neighbors I'd invited, but more members from the VFW, a group from the food pantry, even kids from the high school he'd spoken to years ago about service and sacrifice. They lined the path hats over hearts, and there just behind the crowd were my parents. Mom's arms crossed tight Dad's face, set in that guarded neutral again. But they were here. They could see what they'd tried to pretend didn't exist. The chaplain from the VA started the short ceremony. He spoke of duty not as a word, but as a life lived for others. Of how illness doesn't erase worth and how the measure of a community is how it treats its elders when they can no longer stand on their own. I stood beside Grandpa's chair, letting the words land on him like sunlight. Then Morales stepped forward. "Sergeant Major Hall," he said, voice, "carrying on behalf of those you served with and those who came after, we thank you." The crowd rose to attention. And as if on cue, every veteran present, Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, saluted. The sound of boots snapping together echoed off the brick walls. I turned to my parents. "Step forward," I said quietly enough for only them to hear. Mom's eyes narrowed. "This is not optional," I cut in. "This is where you choose." For a long moment, they didn't move. Then Dad stepped out first. Mom followed stiff, like every step was a negotiation with herself. They came to stand before Grandpa. "You're going to kneel," I told them, because respect is more than a feeling. It's an action. There was a murmur in the crowd. People weren't sure what they were seeing or if they were meant to. But the space around us felt charged like the air before a storm breaks. Dad knelt first. His right knee hit the stone with a muted thud. Mom hesitated, eyes darting to the onlookers, but then she lowered herself, careful not to wrinkle her skirt. Grandpa looked at them both, his expression unreadable at first. Then he nodded, once slow. "That's better," he said. I leaned down so only they could hear. "This isn't punishment. This is clarity. You will not forget this, and neither will I." They both stared at the ground, but I saw the color rise in my mother's cheeks. My father swallowed hard. I straightened, letting the silence do the rest. Then I turned to Morales. "Let's finish this right." Morales barked present arms, and every veteran snapped their salute again. This time, my parents stayed kneeling until the last hand dropped. Afterward, people came up to shake Grandpa's hand, tell him stories they remembered from decades ago. The high school kids gave him a card they'd all signed. The chaplain offered a prayer. My parents hovered at the edge, no longer in control of the space, no longer able to hide behind closed doors and drawn curtains. When the crowd thinned, I wheeled Grandpa toward the hospital entrance. He was tired but smiling faintly. "You pulled it off?" he murmured. "Not for the sake of pulling it off," I said. "For the sake of making sure they'll never forget." He patted my hand. "They won't. And maybe, one day, they'll understand." I don't know if they ever will, but I do know this justice isn't always about courtrooms or laws. Sometimes it's about creating a moment so clear, so unshakable, that the people who need to remember can't rewrite it later. If you've got someone in your life who stood for you when it was hard, stand for them when it's your turn. Do it loud if you must, quiet if you can, but do it in a way they'll never forget. Because dignity isn't given, it's defended. And love isn't a word, it's the act of showing up, even when you've been told not to.